The most immediate and overpowering difference is obviously in the portrayal of both the Batman and of Bruce Wayne, the man behind the mask. Depicted over the years as alternatively a concerned do-gooder and a revenge-driven psychopath, the character as presented here manages to bridge both of those interpretations quite easily, while integrating them into a much larger and more persuasively realized personality. Every subtlety of expression, every nuance of body language, serves to demonstrate that this Batman has finally become what he should have always been. He is a legend. Alan Moore, The Introduction to Dark Knight Returns, 1986. Welcome to Marxist Theories and Lore. This week, we're tackling something a little different from what we've done before. Pop culture detritus. I wanted to do something that would make people angry and, while I know enough about communism to get tankies fuming about trots or anarchists fuming about red-brown shit stains, those are both unfortunately tiny communities. Sometimes you have to cover a topic with wide appeal that will make a lot of people angry. So, this week, instead of doing incomprehensible jokes about D&D and J. Posadas, I asked the simple question: is Batman fascist? This is a more interesting question than might immediately be apparent. Like, obviously, Batman is a commercial property owned by Warner Brothers for making comic books, movies, cereal, and underpants. More than that, Batman is a comic created by Bill Finger and, to an extent, Bob Kane. It was created as work for hire for the progenitors of Warner Brothers, but Bob Kane entered into an elaborate pantomime to scam back some level of royalties and credit for Batman. All the while, Bill Finger was creating the stuff we think of when we think of Batman: the name Bruce Wayne, Gotham City, the Batmobile, the Joker, Catwoman, Penguin, Scarecrow, Clayface, Robin. Batman is one of the oldest and most endearing superhero characters. He's evolved tremendously since his creation. He's had movies about him basically since his inception. He occupies a mythopoeic space that was once occupied by the gods of old. Figures of poetry that inform our dreams and tell us who we could be. But he also occupies a commercial space where he's trying to sell you Funko Pops. Most modern versions of Batman exist as a more, quote, realistic antidote to Superman. Superman is the, at least to me, very affecting fantasy that a man with incredible power can refuse all the temptations to enrich himself and instead use his powers to make the world a better place. Not a less shitty place, the best we could ever aspire to, but a better place. And this is seen by many as unrealistic. So, Batman is the more realistic, cynical version of a man with incredible power doing good. He dresses up like a bat and beats up criminals. The old gods had many different variants. There was stock Hermes, but regional cults would craft their own mythologies. In Hellenized Egypt, you had Thoth Hermes, who was kinda Thoth and was kinda Hermes, and later on you had Thrice Great Hermes, who was a human sage who may have been the inspiration for the god Hermes or a student of real Hermes. The tail end of this process was just as the concept of orthodoxy was beginning to develop within Christianity, or to be more specific, the concept of a canon of texts that are in continuity. I bring this up because Batman likewise has many different gradations. He began as a gritty pulp vigilante, although as his cultural import grew and the moral panic around comic books increased, he became a strangely squeaky clean adventurer in a mad world. Eventually, this depiction of him as an exaggerated 1950s moral paragon dad in a world of giant gimmick grandfather clocks and clown-painted fish snapped back, and he became a dark pulp vigilante again. And this general tendency has slowly increased in the comics since the time of the classic Adam West Batman show. Probably the most iconic version of comic book Batman is basically a textbook fascist strongman. Gotham is a doomed nation. Only by returning to a life of action can Bruce Wayne truly live. His villains are laughably frail shells of their former selves, but they're also the most dangerous they've ever been. He even has an army of disaffected thugs who worship him. He has an uncomfortable relationship with a young girl of dubious age. So, which is the real Batman? The Doodle of Diedrich Bader on your underoos? The Christian Bale movies? Or the elderly jacked man in a bat tank shooting bat rubber bullets at protesters? Or, to ask the question that the title of this video is trying to get at, is fascism a central aspect of the character of Batman? Does it just naturally come oozing out of the character? In my heart, I feel like the real version of Batman is whatever the current canon in the comic books is. I suspect that for many others, animated versions of Batman are the real version. There's probably someone out there who thinks Batfleck is the real Batman, but I'll be damned if I've ever run into him. But basically, I have to take a holistic approach to this. They're all Batman. Comics Batman developed with a large number of specific traits that accrued over time. He has a rule about not killing criminals. It's justified in modern versions by him not wanting other people to go through the grief he suffered as a child, but really it was put in place because comics at the time were children's entertainment, and they suffered extreme, censorious scrutiny in the 1950s. But also, Batman has appeared in literally thousands of comics. You can mine basically anything you can imagine out of comics Batman. But the character maintains a trajectory of what he's done before. I try to keep in mind a kind of amalgamation of comics over a period of time. But also, The Dark Knight Returns casts a long shadow that is impossible to ignore. Cartoon Batman is constructed on top of comics Batman, but not buried under the baggage of thousands of comics where he meets his alien clone. He's typically been a kidified version of the comics, although there are modern versions that reject this. And there are versions that are all the more kidified. Live-action Batman is a little bit more interesting. The Adam West Batman existed in a continuum with the comics from a few years previous, but already the comics were starting to take on a darker and grittier posture. Since then, the live-action Batman has only gotten darker and grittier and more violent. Batman's long-established rule is out the window as Michael Keaton hurls henchmen out of the window. During the 90s, Batman still had a strong camp edge, even as early as the Tim Burton movies. But by Batman Begins, this was basically snuffed out and the character has grown darker, more brooding, angrier, and more bloodthirsty. So, Batman is big. When talking about Batman, you have to survey the main versions, and you're never going to fill every single edge case. A lot of people try to separate the old fascism of the 20th century and more modern far-right movements. Most of this is cynical. People doing this are mostly fascists themselves and trying to avoid being compared to the fascists of old. There is no way to rehabilitate the original Nazis to a general audience, even in this time of growing fascism. Right now, this second. This may change in the not-too-distant future. A few are gormless liberals who will happily believe the cynical fascist liars because it allows them to cling to their understanding that everything can be turned back to normal. Neither of these is worth worrying much about. In the Karl Marx, history repeats itself first as tragedy, second as farce construction. We're in the wind-up to when the joke of fascism really gets rolling. The levels of farce we are definitely going to hit are incomprehensible to us. We've just passed the beer hall putsch. As an aside, I'm sorry. That paraphrasing is from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, where Marx analyzes the proto-fascist movement that somehow impossibly brought Napoleon's failed nephew to power in France. Major far-right leaders are all too often not just clowns, but ridiculous and pathetic clowns. It's about as relevant as you can get in a video essay about fascism. There's two ways I like to think about fascism. It's a phenomenon that emerges out of a particular set of material conditions. A more or less orthodox Marxist position on fascism is that it's a form of mass movement that emerges when capitalism is in crisis and the small-holding capitalists are losing their class position and being proletarianized. That is, they can no longer make money from the small businesses they own, and they have to get a job doing some kind of wage labor. The ideology of fascism grows out of the large holding capitalists trying to shift the blame away from the system itself for systemic flaws. The ideology captures the proletarianizing small capitalists, and very bad things indeed happen if they manage to capture state power. The resurgence among the new fascism of today emerged with Gamergate. There was a certain type of man who believed that he held natural rights and privileges to control media around him. As new demographics opened up for the media they believed they held natural rights and control of, a mass movement metastasized. I would adjust the orthodox Marxist definition of fascism to account for this new cultural fascism. But it is fundamentally the same process of people with modest power losing that power and an ideology emerging to contain and direct their rage against softer targets than the people with real cultural power. Obviously, Batman is not a proletarianizing capitalist, but he may play some part in this emergence of ideology. On the other side, fascist movements have a bunch of characteristics that you can identify. You know it when you see it, as it were. Umberto Eco's essay, Fascism, is helpful for collecting a large number of these traits together. He grew up inside fascist Italy. In this essay, he lays out 14 common attributes of fascism. I'm going to sort them into strong attributes that most versions of Batman have, weaker attributes that have shown up many times, and attributes that Batman doesn't really exhibit. The first of Eco's attributes of fascism that basically every version of Batman exhibits is 3. The cult of action for action's sake. This is the conceit of a character created for action stories. It's rather baked into the method of storytelling. Are superhero stories themselves fascist, action stories in general? The second of Eco's attributes that basically every version of Batman has is 7, nationalism. I don't necessarily mean that Batman wears an American flag as a cape while shilling war bonds. Okay, he did during World War II. There's a tension within this concept of nationalism. At its core, it's a tool to define in-groups and out-groups. Nationalism tends to be extremely toxic when it comes from a hegemonic cultural position. It can be incredibly arbitrary. Ethnicity can be a basically unimpeachable rule that will come to matter absolutely not one bit if it's inconvenient. This is really the form of nationalism Eco is grasping at. Coming from a source of marginalized communities, nationalism can sometimes be a tool to build community among an oppressed nation. The fascist aspect of nationalism harkens back to an imagined better age, where the in-group was strong, and the out-group had not yet infiltrated and weakened their paragons of virtue. This is a later aspect of Batman's development, but it became incredibly indelible. Batman has a profound sense of place. He is securely grounded in Gotham City. Gotham City is Batman's city. It's his property. It's a core aspect of basically every version of Batman after the early 70s. Once, Gotham was a gleaming city on a hill, but it has been infiltrated with crime, and is a churning hellscape. Batman does what he does because he wants to transform it into something better. Make Gotham City great again. If you're thinking, oh, there's 14 of these attributes and Batman skipped over basically half of them, you're probably feeling pretty smug, but after this, Batman embodies all of them to some extent. Attribute 8 is that there's some ginned-up enemy that is incredibly weak but also secretly very powerful. For real-world fascist movements, these enemies are entirely illusionary, but Batman is himself an illusion, so these villains for him are very much real. This is rather baked into the story structure of most Batman stories. There's a crime, Batman goes to investigate, he gets dunked on or defeated. He curses the villain, and uses his Batman preparation powers. Finally, he defeats the villain with his masculinity. This is pretty common but not universal in action stories and superhero stories in general. Attribute 9 is the ingrained perpetual struggle. For Batman, the struggle against crime is his life. If ever he is injured or just plain old, this will be an intolerable problem. Dark Knight Returns begins with Bruce Wayne crashing a race car because he's depressed that he's too old to be Batman anymore. Attribute 10 is the separation of society into strong and weak. This is extremely foundational to a lot of more modern versions of Batman, starting with The Dark Knight Returns. If someone wants to join Batman in his violence crusade, he will immediately reject them, like a rabbi rejecting a convert. Only if they prove their strength will Batman accept them as one of his swarm of sidekicks. This is the basis of almost every one of the other side Gotham superheroes. Attribute 11 is the cult of the individualist hero. Strangely enough, this is a common feature in a lot of older comics, but in modern versions has largely faded away. As superhero comics have taken on a more soap opera structure and grown away from the straight-up action stories, there's less of a focus on special individualist heroes. Indeed, many of them feature drama about how the existing individualist hero shouldn't be an individualist. Batman can do what he does because he's a special individualist. His Robins, Night's Wing, Batgirl, etc. are also special individualists. Attribute 12 is machismo. Very closely connected to this, the core of basically all modern far-right formations today is centered around misogyny, which they have taken as a specific form of machismo. Most modern far-right formulations are little more than cargo cults to masculinity, trying to use illusions of strength and hate to make themselves feel like real men. Batman at least avoids the most toxic forms of masculinity. Perhaps he has a little bit too much dedication to his work, but that's it. For almost all of Batman's history, he is held up as a paragon of masculinity. By the 1950s, he was a strangely gentle father figure, and a proxy for much of the audience built in as Robin. The Adam West version mutated into a kitsched sex object with blurred levels of irony. As writers and artists reacted against both of these forms, he became a sexy super spy in the 70s, and the reaction against that led to the volcel violence monk that Batman still tends toward today. He is strong, he is stoic, he works hard, all women want to fuck him, he does not eat pussy. He is what society wants men to believe we should be. Batman has embodied 13, and recently even, but it's not ubiquitous enough that I'll skip over it and continue on to 14, Newspeak. Much like how the modern far right has embraced infantilized methods of discourse, friends and clown frogs and horrendous childish memes, Batman drives the Batmobile to his Batcave to fly his Batwing to the moon, where he will make plans on his Batbase to beat up the Justice League with bats. This grew out of Batman's history as a thing for child's entertainment. It has remained very strong because of its utility as a marketing device, branding. The Batmobile is easier to sell than Bruce Wayne's Ferrari, and you don't have to license it. There's two characteristics that are not as strongly attested across Batman's history, but have still shown up from time to time. 4, disagreement is treason has shown up in often exaggerated forms. But from a narrative sense, this is pretty much always used as something to criticize Batman about. Batman gets angry that one of his sidekicks didn't do something the way he thinks it should have been done. This is shown as Batman being unreasonable and having unreasonable expectations about people, but also it usually turns out that Batman was right, just being an asshole about it. The final aspect of Umberto Eco's understanding of fascism that Batman sometimes but not usually displays is false populism. It's how the ideology of fascism emerges to manage dissent. In the context of Batman, this is a narrative trick where Bruce Wayne gives tremendous amounts of money to charity, but because charity does not really make social change, and because Warner Brothers is going to keep exploiting Batman as long as they can, it doesn't have an effect on the descent of Gotham into worse and worse social conditions. There are attributes of Eco's understanding of fascism that Batman doesn't really adhere to. Fascism often has a cult of tradition, attribute 1, that is tied to weird syncretism. While Batman sometimes can adhere to weird syncretism, check Grant Morrison's Batman Run or Neil Adams' Batman Odyssey, but Batman is basically never brought up as a paragon of traditional values. He's a pervert in a BDSM costume. On the other side of the cult of tradition is 2, the rejection of modernism. Fascists view the modern world as decadent and degenerate. You might be able to squint and see hints of this at the edges in unintended ways. Gotham City always has to be horrible, after all. But going too far grandstanding about degenerates would make it harder to sell underoos. It's the upside of Batman being a volcel who doesn't even know cunnilingus exists. The 5th trait, anti-diversity, is another one that is hard to grapple with when you're trying to sell Funko Pops. Explicit racism will turn away a large portion of your audience. Either people don't want to think of themselves as racist and will balk if it's presented too openly, or people genuinely believe diversity is a strength, not a failure. It's not good business. The 6th trait, social frustration, is how Eco grapples with the material basis of the mass movement phase of fascism. Batman is not a smallholding capitalist being forced to proletarianize against his will. But he is a social construct created out of the capitalist milieu, so in times of crisis he will accrue attributes that affect the way people think about the world. Compare Batman comics in times when media becomes extremely tough on crime. I think this all pretty clearly establishes that Batman embodies a large majority of common traits of fascism. Eco doesn't lay out a specific litmus test for how many traits equals fascism. Some fascist movements only have a few. Several of these attributes are really part and parcel to the genre of action storytelling, and more so superheroes in general. Does Batman exhibit these attributes because Batman has special Hitler particles above and beyond what exists in his super friends? Or are the superheroes themselves fascist? I'm going to go through a selection of some of the more popular and culturally important superheroes to poke at this question. First up is Superman. He exhibits action for action's sake and the imagined enemy very strongly. He has sometimes held up versions of nationalism, though strangely not as strongly as you would expect from someone who represents, quote, truth, justice, and the American way. More likely, Superman is a rootless cosmopolitan who emigrated from his Eastern European home of Krypton after the violence against his people became too strong, and he grew up in Smallville. His adult life is spent in Metropolis, but he's not really tied in the place. His civilian identity is as a journalist a job that sends him all across the world and sometimes space. Several versions of Superman also accrete a strange form of newspeak, oftentimes importing Kryptonese words for an English-speaking audience. So that's maybe 4 attributes if you squint, and most of those are tied to action storytelling itself. Superman is not especially more fascist than your average superhero. Next, let's talk about Daredevil, another character that shares a lot in common with Batman in particular. If being a serious Catholic who is also a ninja isn't traditionalism plus weird syncretism, I don't know what that is. Obviously, he has action for action's sake and nationalism, for Hell's Kitchen like Batman for Gotham. Daredevil is always on the financial edge. Sometimes he's a lawyer, sometimes he's disbarred because they found out he's Daredevil, and so he fits into social frustration. Likewise, his villains often adhere to the dichotomy of being simultaneously strong and weak. Obviously, he is another individualist hero, although sometimes Daredevil can get over this. And he adheres to machismo perhaps better than Batman himself. Daredevil has indeed heard of cunnilingus. So I would say Daredevil probably qualifies as fasc-adjacent at least. Alright, how about Spider-Man? He has action for action's sake in the cult of the individualist hero, even if he's forced to team up with Daredevil or Black Cat or Venom or whatever. He has a strong sense of place, although I would hesitate to call this the same type of nationalism that Batman and Daredevil have. Verdict: not fascist. Alright, one more. How about Captain America? He generally adheres to traditionalism with weird syncretism. Like, he's made out of horrifying mad science and yearns for a simpler, vaguely liberal New Deal-style capital D democracy. He has action for action's sake and constant struggle. Weirdly, he manages to dodge having nationalism, or at least the form of nationalism fascism adheres to. Nationalism in fascism imagines a mythic former state where violence necessary to enact it is just and moral and necessary. Cap pointedly doesn't want to return to homophobia or Jim Crow. Cap doesn't want the tool of America to be used to tell him who his enemies are. He wants to use the tool of America for community building. He doesn't want America to be great again. He wants America to be kind again. And he's kind of dumb for thinking that it ever was kind in the first place, but that's not fascism. That's beautiful. And the world would be a better place if the liberals he's molded after took that view more seriously. So, out of a bunch of the most popular superheroes, they mostly show far fewer attributes of fascism. That implies that superheroes are not inherently fascist. Batman is an outlier. For a moment, let's dig down into action storytelling itself. Action as a genre generally doesn't utilize elaborate plots or tricks of storytelling. The best action stories are vehicles for cool set pieces and exciting scenes of action. You need a reason for crazy things to happen, though. Without context, action scenes become incomprehensible. The basics of what are necessary for an action story are 3. Action for action's sake, 9. Perpetual struggle, 11. Individualist hero, and 12. Machismo. These are all very easy ways to gin up a reason for action sequences to happen. If they are avoided, they are oftentimes subverted, or they're used for irony's sake. I would say that action storytelling itself isn't quite fascist, but it can fall that way with a solid push to the right. I think I've established that Batman has a role in bundling the ideas that make up fascism together, in a way that makes them more palatable. This isn't Warner Brothers trying to do the Gotham City putsch. It's an emergent property of who wants to engage with Batman media, and trying to appeal to those people. I know a lot of people on the left who enjoy Batman media, the various movies, comics, video games, and liking Batman doesn't make you a fascist. It's just that the guy who puts on a silly uniform to beat up criminals drags a lot of baggage with him. If you enjoyed this video, please go out into your community and do some good. Volunteer for community defense organizations to disrupt real-world fascists, and make our communities safer. Join your local Food Not Bombs, Salt a Union. Find people who are already doing good work to support their communities, and join them. And if you need me to Sin Eater for you, you can like, comment, subscribe, etc., etc., etc. I'm on Masto as Marxist lore at mastodon.online, and you can do ineffective altruism by donating to patreon.com/socialismisgood. Oh, you want an after-credits sequence? Shit, okay. Next time I'll ask the much more important question, is Superman communist?